In the heart of an Oregon forest, a storm reveals a hidden secret that changes one man's life forever. What Ethan finds inside a fallen tree will break your heart and restore your faith in humanity. Watch till the end and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more true and powerful stories. The storm had passed, but the forest hadn't yet remembered how to breathe. The sky over northern Oregon hung low and heavy, as if the clouds themselves were exhausted. The smell of wet pine and mud filled the air, thick enough to taste. Branches littered the path, snapped like bones, and mist curled through the trees, whispering between the trunks. Ethan Walker tightened the straps of his gloves and adjusted the chainsaw slung across his shoulder. 15 years of clearing storm damage had taught him that the silence after a storm was never true silence. There was always something waiting beneath it, something broken, unseen. He started his morning the way he always did, with discipline and focus. The chainsaw roared to life, tearing through the stillness. Damp sawdust sprayed across his boots as he worked methodically, clearing fallen limbs from the narrow ranger path. Cut, lift, move, repeat, the rhythm he trusted to drown out thought. But today, the rhythm didn't calm him. The forest felt wrong. Even the birds refused to sing. No rustling leaves, no insects humming, only the distant drip of water from broken branches. He paused, resting his arm against a trunk, and scanned the slope ahead. The storm had torn through this stretch of forest with particular cruelty. Trees lay scattered like casualties, roots clawing at the air, the soil beneath them churned and raw. His eyes stopped on one shape that didn't blend with the rest, a massive oak, lying twisted near the bend of a shallow creek. Its roots were half exposed, its bark stripped and scarred in a way that looked deliberate. Ethan frowned. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into wet moss. The closer he got, the stranger it seemed. Around the base of the trunk were deep claw marks, uneven and wild, as if something had fought either to enter or escape. He crouched down, tracing the grooves with his gloved fingers. The sap was still sticky, the edges fresh. Whatever made those marks had been here recently, maybe even last night. A chill moved up his spine. He'd seen claw marks before, bear, cougar, even the occasional wolf, but these didn't fit any pattern he knew. They were frantic, almost human in their desperation. He leaned closer to the hollow that gaped near the base of the fallen oak. Inside was nothing but darkness. The scent rising from it was thick and strange, not just decay, but something musky, alive. He hesitated. Logic told him to move on. It was probably a fox den or a raccoon hiding place, yet something tugged at him, a quiet, inexplicable pull, as if the forest itself was asking him not to walk away. He turned off the chainsaw, crouched lower, and pressed his ear near the opening. At first, he heard only the steady drip of water. Then, faintly, a sound, a whimper, so soft he almost thought he'd imagined it. He froze. Another sound followed, weaker this time, trembling like wind caught inside a bottle. Ethan's pulse quickened. That wasn't the wind. "Hello?" he called quietly, feeling foolish for talking to a tree. No answer, just another whimper, higher, frightened, alive. He set the saw aside, dropped to one knee, and reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt. The beam pierced the hollow, cutting through the darkness like a blade. For a moment, he saw only damp wood and shadows. Then something moved. Two glints of light reflected back at him, eyes, small and round, blinking in the beam. Ethan's breath caught. Inside the hollow, pressed together, were two tiny shapes covered in wet, matted fur. bear cubs. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. They couldn't have been more than a few months old. The larger one was trembling, its little body curled protectively around the smaller one. When Ethan adjusted the flashlight, he noticed a dark patch on the smaller cub's shoulder, blood glistening fresh. Panic struck him. If the cubs were here, then the mother had to be close, and a black bear defending her young was nothing to trifle with. He rose slowly, scanning the fog-choked trees. Nothing moved. No sound, no breath of wind, only that dreadful quiet. Ethan swallowed hard and knelt again, careful not to startle the cubs. "Easy there, little ones," he murmured, his voice softer now. The cubs whimpered but didn't move. The smaller one's breathing was shallow, labored. His stomach tightened. He'd seen herd animals before, but never something so young, so defenseless. He fumbled for his phone and dialed 911. His voice shook as he explained the situation. 2 bear cubs, one injured, found in a fallen oak near Silver Ridge. The dispatcher told him to stay put. A wildlife rescue team was already on the way. When the call ended, Ethan remained crouched beside the tree, the fog thickening around him. Every so often, one of the cubs whimpered again, and he would whisper something quiet, reassuring, as though the words could ease their fear. He wasn't sure who he was really comforting, them or himself. Time dragged like wet branches, then, faintly, he heard the low growl of an approaching engine. Headlights flickered through the trees. Relief washed over him. He stood and waved as a dark green truck pulled to a stop nearby. 2 figures climbed out. A woman in her 40s with calm eyes and a ranger badge on her jacket, and a younger man carrying a medical kit. "Ethan Walker?" the woman asked. "I'm Ranger Karen Delaney, Oregon Wildlife Rescue. You called about the cubs?" He nodded quickly. "They're inside the hollow. One's bleeding." Karen crouched near the opening, shining her light inside. Her expression softened with concern. "Poor things," she whispered. "They're only a few months old." She gestured for her partner. "Paul, get the blanket ready. Carefully." Ethan stepped back as they worked, widening the hollow just enough to reach inside. Karen's voice was low and steady, the tone of someone used to easing panic. "It's okay, little one. You're safe now." Slowly, she lifted the first cub out. It gave a weak cry and clutched at her glove. The second cub came next, whimpering softly as Paul wrapped it in a thermal blanket. When Karen examined the wound, her face changed. "This isn't from a fall," she said quietly. "It's a bullet graze." Ethan's blood went cold. "A bullet?" She nodded grimly. "Someone shot them, or their mother." For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain had begun again, light and cold, pattering on the leaves above. Ethan looked into the fog and felt anger stir in his chest, a deep, helpless anger. People could destroy with such ease. As the Rangers carried the cubs to their truck, Karen turned to him. "You did the right thing calling us. They wouldn't have survived another night." Ethan looked back at the fallen oak, at the gaping hollow where he'd found them, and felt the weight of the forest pressing on him. Something about this place, about those tiny cries, had changed him. The chainsaw job didn't matter anymore. The storm hadn't just broken trees, it had uncovered something far more fragile. As the rescue truck disappeared into the mist, Ethan stood alone once more. The silence returned, heavy and endless, but now he knew what lived inside it. The echo of those small cries, the reminder that even in the quietest places, life was still fighting to survive. The forest didn't feel like the same place when Ethan came back. The next morning, Mist still clung low over the ground, moving in slow ribbons between the trunks. The air was colder, heavier, like the storm hadn't really ended, only paused. Ethan parked his truck off the service road and cut the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the yellow tape strung between branches. Wildlife rescue, active scene. He had seen those words before, after car collisions with elk, after illegal dumping. Never here. Never for something that felt this personal. He stepped out. His boots sank into the soft, soaked earth. The forest, usually full of layered sounds, wind, birds, insects, branches creaking, was still holding its breath. He could hear distant water moving somewhere down the slope, the same creek that bent around the clearing. Everything else was quiet. He followed the tape. The fallen oak lay where he'd left it, massive and scarred, its uprooted base torn from the soil like muscle from bone. Yesterday he'd seen it as a strange tree. Now he saw it as a shelter, a hiding place, a last refuge. The hollow at its base gaped open, wider now. The claw marks were clearer in daylight. Ethan crouched and ran his fingers over them. They weren't random, they were desperate. You could feel it in the way they raked, again and again, deep, torn, uneven. He imagined tiny paws fighting to wedge themselves inside that dark space, while the world outside was breaking apart. He swallowed hard. He remembered the sound. Not the storm, not the wind, but the small, helpless whimpering. The moment he'd heard it, everything else in him had gone quiet and focused. He could still hear it like an echo caught in his chest. "Walker?" The voice behind him made him turn. Two people were standing by the tape, both in dark jackets marked with state insignia. One of them, taller, broad-shouldered, early 50s with a close-cropped beard, stepped forward and offered a gloved hand. Raymond Cole, Wildlife Crimes Division. Ethan shook his hand. "Yeah, I'm Ethan. I heard you were the one who called in the rescue yesterday." Ethan nodded. "I found the cubs in that hollow. One of them was bleeding. Ranger Delaney took them." Cole's expression tightened with something between respect and anger. "You saved them," he said simply. "If you hadn't stopped here, we'd be picking up bodies, not cubs." That sentence hit harder than Ethan expected. He glanced towards the tree again. "How bad was the little one?" "The smaller one," Cole said. "Shoulder wound, bullet graze, close. Another inch, and it wouldn't have been a graze." Ethan exhaled slowly. "That was a bullet?" "Yeah." Ethan's jaw flexed. "Who shoots at bear cubs?" Cole looked at him for a long second, then shook his head. "They weren't aiming for the cubs." Something in his tone made Ethan's stomach go tight. Cole motioned for him to follow. "Come on, you should see this." They moved off the trail, stepping over broken branches and slick moss-covered stones. The ground dipped and rose again, leading toward a cluster of boulders near the creek. The air felt colder here. He could smell iron, wet earth, something else behind it. When Cole stopped, Ethan saw it. The body lay between two rocks, half in shadow. A black bear, full-grown, female. Even in death, she was enormous. Muscle, weight, power. But there was something frightening about how still she was. Her eyes had gone glassy and distant. Her side was crusted with dried blood, dark against wet fur. And in the middle of her chest, just behind the shoulder, was a clean entry wound. Not torn, not shredded, precise. Silence pressed in hard. Ethan felt it in his teeth. Cole crouched beside the body. His voice was quieter now. "We moved her at sunrise for lab work. I wanted you to know what you found out here wasn't an accident." Ethan stared. The world narrowed to the bear and the wound. "She's the mother," he said, and his own voice sounded far away. Cole nodded once. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't say anything. His thoughts spun through everything at once. The hollow trunk, the claw marks, the cubs pressed together, shaken, the tiny cry that broke into a cough, and this. Her. Somebody walked into these woods, Ethan said slowly, shot her with a rifle and left her here, just like this. Yes. They didn't even take. He stopped, throat tight. They just left her. Cole's jaw worked. That's the part that'll make you angry, he said. This wasn't even for meat. Ethan looked at him sharply. Then what was it for? Cole straightened. His expression wasn't just tired. It was used to being tired. Like this conversation was one he'd had too many times and hated every single one. We've had a poaching ring working this region off and on for months, he said. They go after elk during the rut. Sometimes they take bear. They sell gallbladders, claws, pelts, nothing legal, nothing tracked, cash only. They've hit Silver Ridge, Broken Creek, and about 4 miles north of here, we've been trying to catch them. Ethan felt heat rise in his chest. And you think this is them? I know it is, Cole said. We pulled a .308 caisson from 50 yards up slope, fresh. We saw boot tracks that weren't here before the storm. Size 12, heavy heel, same pattern we've logged from other shots. She bled out right here. The cubs ran. They hid in that hollow and screamed until you heard them. Something ugly twisted in Ethan's gut and stayed there. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even shock anymore. It was anger. Deep, heavy, cold. He'd spent his life in these woods. He'd seen lightning tear trees in half. He'd seen landslides eat whole hillsides. He respected that kind of damage. It belonged to the world. This didn't. This was a choice. He knelt beside the bear. Up close, she didn't look violent. She looked tired. Old leaves were stuck in the wet fur near her neck. One ear was torn, healed long ago, like she'd survived fights and winters before this one. She hadn't died running. She'd died standing. Ethan swallowed. His voice was barely there when he asked, "How long ago?" "Less than 24 hours when we got here," Cole said. "Storm probably scared them off before they could strip anything and go. That storm might have saved the cubs." The words hung in the air. The storm that tore the forest apart might have been the only reason those cubs were still alive. Ethan stayed there a while, saying nothing. He had always thought of the forest as a system. Storms come, trees fall, crews clear, trails reopen. You respect the land. You don't cheat it. You don't take more than you can live with. You don't break something that can't heal. Looking at the bear, he felt something else. Responsibility. Not for what happened, for what came next. Cole stood and pulled a small notebook from his jacket. "I'll need a short statement," he said. "Just what you saw, what time you called, what you heard." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, whatever you need." They went through it. When he'd first seen the fallen oak, when he'd noticed the claw marks, the first time he heard the whimpering, the way the smaller cub breathed, shallow, uneven, the call to 911, Ranger Delaney's arrival, the bullet wound. Cole wrote everything down fast and clean. When they finished, he closed the notebook and said quietly, "They're at Silver Creek now. That's our rehab center. They'll stabilize the injured cub, keep them together, monitor them. Best place they could be." Ethan exhaled. Some of the tension in his shoulders eased. "They'll live?" "If infection doesn't set in," Cole said, "they've got a real shot." Ethan nodded. It wasn't relief, not exactly, but it was something close. Cole glanced at him. "You did more than you think." Ethan shook his head. "I just heard them." "That's more than most people do," Cole said. They walked back toward the fallen oak together. The clearing felt different now. Yesterday, it had been the place where he'd found something. Today, it felt like the place where something had been taken. Cole stopped at the tree line. "We'll finish up here soon," he said. "But I'll tell you this much. We're not letting this go. We've got prints, casings, tire tracks leading to an unregistered hunting cabin deeper north. Whoever did this didn't just break a law. They left 2 orphans in a storm and walked away. I take that personally." Ethan looked at him good. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Water dripped steadily from the torn canopy above. The air felt cold in Ethan's lungs. Finally, Cole held out his card. "If you remember anything else, you call me directly, day or night." Ethan slid the card into his jacket pocket. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I will." Cole nodded once, then turned and headed for the taped line, calling instructions to one of the officers near the truck. Ethan stayed. He walked back to the hollow and crouched there, resting one hand on the damp bark. The space inside looked bigger now that it was empty. Darker, too. He imagined 2 small bodies pressed together in that darkness, shaken, making themselves as small as possible, waiting for something that never came back. He felt anger again, but under it, something else had started to grow. Guilt. Not guilt for what had happened, he knew that. Guilt for how close he'd come to walking past them. He could have kept cutting trail. He could have ignored the wrong feeling in the air, pretended not to hear that first tiny cry. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem, and if he had, those cubs would be dead right now. He let that settle. He absorbed it. Then, standing alone in the mist, he made a quiet promise to himself. He wasn't done. Not just with the cubs, with all of it. With whatever kind of people walked into a protected forest, shot a mother bear at point-blank range, and left her young to shiver in a storm. With whatever kind of thinking said that was normal, acceptable, forgettable. He wasn't going to forget. Slowly, he rose. The clearing felt colder than when he'd arrived and somehow emptier. He picked up his gloves and slung his chainsaw over his shoulder, but he didn't start it. Work didn't matter right now. He turned toward the trail. Before he left, he looked back one last time at the fallen oak. The claw marks, the hollow, the memory of 2 small faces staring out at him with wide, frightened eyes. He had walked into this place as a cleanup man. He was leaving it as something else. When he finally headed back toward his truck through the mist, he already knew where he was going next. Silver Creek. The road to Silver Creek wound through miles of misty forest, twisting between slopes where fallen branches still littered the ground from the storm. Ethan drove slowly, his hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying the images in his mind. The hollow oak, the cubs huddled in darkness, and the lifeless body of their mother lying between moss-covered stones. Each memory cut a little deeper. He had told himself he only wanted to make sure the cubs survived. But the truth was heavier. He needed to see them again, to remind himself that something in this forest had been saved. When he reached the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the morning air smelled of disinfectant and hay. Beyond the gates stretched a quiet compound of metal enclosures and low buildings surrounded by tall firs. Workers moved in silence, carrying trays of food and blankets. There was no chaos here, just the steady rhythm of care. A volunteer greeted him and led him down a narrow hallway lined with glass partitions. Inside each enclosure were the wounded survivors of the storm. Owls with bandaged wings, fox kits curled in straw, a fawn learning to stand on splinted legs. The sound of breathing, rustling, and the faint hum of heaters filled the corridor. At the end of the hall stood a young veterinarian in a white coat. Her dark hair pulled into a loose braid. She smiled when she saw him. "You must be Mr. Walker," she said. "I'm Dr. Emily Rhodes. Ranger Delaney told me you'd probably come." Ethan nodded, his voice low. "I wanted to know how they're doing." Emily's expression softened. "They're stronger than I expected," she said. "Come, I'll show you." She led him into a small observation room where 2 heat lamps glowed softly over a large pen filled with straw. Inside, the cubs lay pressed together, breathing in sync, their black fur clean and glistening. The smaller one, the one with the bullet graze, had its shoulder wrapped in gauze, but its eyes were open now, clear and alert. Ethan stepped closer to the glass. "They're alive," he whispered, almost in disbelief. Emily smiled faintly. "Alive, yes. Lucky, too. The bullet didn't hit bone. We cleaned the wound, started antibiotics. They're eating, drinking, sleeping. They'll make it." He nodded slowly, unable to look away. The cubs were no longer trembling. They looked calm, safe. The sight brought an ache to his chest that felt almost like relief. Emily continued quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "It's hard to imagine, isn't it? Something so small, surviving all that." Ethan swallowed. "What about their mother?" Emily's expression darkened. "Ranger Delaney told me what they found. It's not the first case we've seen this year." He turned toward her. "You mean poaching?" "Yes," she said, folding her arms. "The Wildlife Crimes Division has been chasing a ring across 3 counties. They kill bears for parts, bile, claws, pelts, sell them out of state. It's disgusting." Ethan felt the anger return, burning low and cold. They killed her for money. Emily nodded. "They always do." He stared back at the cubs, the glow of the heat lamp reflecting off the glass. "I want them caught," he said quietly. "Whoever did this." "There will be," Emily replied, her tone steady. "Officer Cole is working the case. They found shells, tire tracks, even a cabin near Silver Ridge. It's only a matter of time." For a moment, silence hung between them. The cubs stirred slightly, one pressing its nose into the other's neck. Ethan's throat tightened. "Do they know?" he asked. Emily frowned gently. "Know what?" "That she's gone." The vet hesitated, then spoke softly. "Animals don't grieve like we do. They sense absence, fear, and safety. Right now they feel warmth, food, and calm. That's what matters." Ethan nodded slowly, though it didn't make the ache disappear. He stayed for a long while, sitting on a low bench near the glass. Emily moved quietly in the background, checking vitals, scribbling notes, adjusting the lamps. Ethan barely noticed. The world outside, his job, the storm damage, the noise of machines, felt distant. Here, everything was slower, smaller, more fragile. At one point, the larger cub lifted its head, blinking sleepily, and looked straight at him. Its eyes were dark and steady, and for an instant Ethan thought it recognized him, the man who had reached into their darkness and pulled them into the light. He almost smiled. When Emily returned, she spoke softly so as not to disturb them. "They'll stay here for a few months. Once they're strong enough, we'll move them to a protected reserve." Ethan looked up. "Will they survive out there?" "If the forest is kind," she said. Then, after a pause, "You'd be surprised how much it remembers. Animals find their way home." He stood slowly, glancing one last time at the cubs. "Home," he repeated quietly. "That's what they deserve." Outside, the rain had stopped and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, painting silver streaks across the wet ground. The air smelled of pine and renewal. Ethan stood by his truck for a long moment before starting the engine. He looked back toward the rehabilitation center, a small island of warmth and mercy in a cold, careless world, and made himself a silent promise. He would not let the story end here. That night, back at his cabin, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear, strong, proud, dying alone between the rocks. He saw the cubs crying in the hollow, waiting for help that never came. But beneath those images, a new one began to form. Two small lives breathing under the glow of a heat lamp, alive because he had stopped, because he had cared. The next morning, his phone buzzed. A message from Ranger Delaney. "We've got a lead." She included a single photo, boot prints near a dirt trail, next to the imprint of a rifle butt pressed into the mud. Underneath it, her message continued. "We'll find them, Ethan. I promise." He stared at the screen for a long time before replying with just 2 words. "I'll help." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't known he was missing. Purpose. Not the kind that came from work or survival, but from the quiet certainty that what he did next mattered. The forest had shown him cruelty. Now it was asking for courage. The sun had just started to rise over the ridge when Ethan's phone buzzed again. The message came from Officer Cole. "We got them." For a few seconds, Ethan just stared at the words glowing on his screen. He read them again, slowly letting the meaning sink in. The 2 men who had turned the forest into a hunting ground, the ones who had left the mother bear bleeding and her cubs to die, had finally been caught. He called Cole immediately. The officer's voice on the other end carried both exhaustion and satisfaction. 2 men, Robert Lane and Travis Heller, Cole said. "We raided their cabin early this morning, found rifles, pelts, and contraband. Their weapons matched the bullet that killed the female bear." Ethan didn't respond right away. He sat on the edge of his bed, one hand pressed to his mouth, listening. Outside, the forest was waking up. Birds calling, wind stirring through the firs, but his mind was stuck on one thought. They're caught. "They'll be charged under federal law," Cole continued. "Illegal hunting in a protected zone, animal cruelty, weapons violations. It's going to be a long list." Ethan finally spoke. 5 years in prison won't bring her back," he said quietly. "No," Cole replied, "but it sends a message. People like them never think they'll get caught. Now they know better." When the call ended, Ethan sat in silence. For weeks, the weight of anger had sat heavy in his chest. Now it shifted into something quieter. Not relief, but something close to peace. Justice didn't heal, but it helped to stop the bleeding. Later that morning, he drove out to the Silver Creek Rehabilitation Center. The road shimmered with leftover rain, sunlight piercing through gaps in the trees. The last time he'd been here, winter still clung to the air. Now the forest was soft with green. Spring had begun. Dr. Emily Rhodes greeted him at the gate with a bright smile. "You came at the right time," she said. "They're doing wonderfully." She led him back through the corridors he now knew by heart. The sounds of the center were familiar. The chirps, the rustle of straw, the low hum of lamps. When they reached the cubs' enclosure, Ethan stopped short. They had grown. The small, fragile creatures he'd found trembling in a hollow tree were gone. In their place were 2 young bears, sleek, strong, and curious. The smaller one, Ash, was climbing on a low branch placed inside the pen, while Willow sat beside the water trough, pawing playfully at the ripples. Ethan felt something swell inside his chest, a quiet mix of pride and sadness. "They've come a long way," Emily said, watching them. Ash's shoulder healed perfectly. You can barely see the scar now. Ethan smiled faintly. "They look ready." "They almost are," she said. "We're preparing them for release. A few more weeks of conditioning, teaching them to find food, climb, avoid people. After that, they'll be going home." "Home," Ethan repeated. The word felt heavy, sacred. Emily turned to him, her voice softening. "You should come when we release them. They wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." He shook his head slightly. "I just found them." "You stopped," she corrected. "Most people wouldn't have. That's what made the difference." For a while, they stood in silence, watching the cubs play. Ash rolled onto his back, wrestling with Willow, who responded with a playful growl that echoed faintly through the hall. The sound made Ethan smile, a sound of life, of defiance against everything cruel in the world. He spoke after a moment. "Cole caught the poachers." Emily turned, surprise flashing across her face. "He did?" Ethan nodded. "This morning, they'll face charges." A quiet relief passed between them. "Good," she said softly. "Maybe now people will think twice before pulling a trigger." Ethan didn't answer right away. He was staring at Ash, who had stopped climbing and was now watching him through the glass. Their eyes met, human and wild, and for an instant the forest didn't feel like two worlds anymore. It felt whole. Emily glanced at him. "You care about them." "I didn't plan to," he said, "but they remind me of something. How fragile everything really is. How easily we destroy things that never had a choice." Her gaze softened. "You've changed, haven't you?" Ethan smiled, faintly but honestly. "Maybe. The forest teaches you things if you listen long enough." He stayed longer than he meant to. Hours passed without him noticing. The cubs' quiet breathing, the faint warmth of the heat lamps, the soft hum of the forest outside. Every sound felt alive. Every breath felt like a promise that the world could still be kind. When he finally left the center, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains. The air smelled of wet pine and blooming earth. As he reached his truck, Ranger Karen Delaney stepped out of a nearby vehicle. She was out of uniform this time, but her expression was the same, calm, steady, and sharp-eyed. "You heard the news," she said. "Cole told me," Ethan replied. "They got them. 5 years each, maybe more," she said. "Fines, hunting bans, federal charges. It's not enough, but it's something." Ethan nodded. "It'll have to be." Karen looked toward the forest, her jaw tightening. "People like them think the world's just theirs to take from, but it isn't. Every now and then, the forest fights back, through people like you." He glanced down, unsure what to say. "I didn't do much." "You did everything," she said simply. "You gave those cubs a chance." They stood quietly for a moment. The sound of the stream carried through the trees, mingled with the wind. The forest that had once felt broken was breathing again. When Karen left, Ethan lingered by his truck, staring at the fading sunlight through the pines. He thought of the cubs playing, of the bear that had died, of the poachers now behind bars. And for the first time in years, he felt like something in his life had come full circle. He looked back at the forest and whispered, "They're safe now." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't closure, but it was peace. That night, as he sat by his cabin window, he watched the forest sway gently under the stars. The wind moved through the branches like breath. Somewhere out there, in the dark, life continued, fragile, beautiful, unbroken. and Ethan understood that justice wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of hope. The morning of the release came soft and golden, wrapped in the calm that only spring could bring to the Oregon forest. The mist lifted slowly from the valley, revealing the reborn greenness of the land. Dew clung to the ferns, and sunlight filtered through tall firs and thin, bright streams. Ethan Walker stood by his truck outside the Silver Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, listening to the hum of life that had returned to the forest. The very forest that had once fallen silent after the storm. Dr. Emily Rhodes met him at the gate with the same warm steadiness she always carried. "They're ready," she said. "Both of them passed all their tests. They're strong, alert, and healthy. It's time." Ethan followed her toward the back of the facility, where 2 large transport crates waited on a flatbed truck. Inside, he could see the dark shapes of the cubs shifting restlessly, not the frightened creatures he had found hiding in a hollow tree, but young bears on the edge of freedom. Their coats gleamed in the sunlight, black and smooth, their eyes full of curiosity and impatience. "They've grown," Ethan murmured. Emily smiled. "They've learned everything they need, how to climb, forage, even avoid humans. Instinct takes over now. They're ready to go home." The word home hung in the air, soft and weighty. For Ethan, it didn't just mean the forest. It meant belonging, survival, second chances. The drive to the release site wound through narrow dirt roads lined with new spring growth. The tires of the truck crunched over gravel and puddles left by the last rain. Beside Ethan sat Ranger Karen Delaney, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes scanning the trees. She had traded her formal ranger uniform for a simple jacket, but the air of command still clung to her. "Feels good, doesn't it?" she said after a while. Ethan nodded. "Better than I expected. For a while, I wasn't sure we'd ever get to this day." Karen smiled faintly. "Most rescues don't end like this. You should be proud." "I didn't save them," he said quietly. "They saved me." Karen didn't press further, but she gave him a knowing look, the kind that needed no words. When they reached the clearing, a cool breeze swept through the open space. A shallow stream cut across the field, its water glittering in the morning light. Tall ferns framed the area like quiet witnesses, and the distant mountains stood wrapped in early fog. Emily and her team were already there, setting up the crates near the stream's edge. The hum of the truck engine faded, replaced by the faint sound of birds and running water. "This is perfect," Emily said. "Plenty of food sources, no nearby roads, full protection zone. They'll be safe here." Ethan stood near the crates, his heart pounding with a strange mix of joy and sadness. Through the narrow slats, he caught a glimpse of the cub's eyes, alert, aware, unafraid. Emily nodded to her assistants. "All right, let's do this." The latches clicked open. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then the first cub, Willow, stepped out cautiously, her nose twitching as she tasted the air. Sunlight caught on her sleek fur, and for the first time she looked truly wild. Behind her came Ash, slower but sure, his once wounded shoulder strong and steady. They paused side by side, their bodies perfectly still, as if sensing the vastness of the world waiting for them. Then, without hesitation, they moved, first walking, then breaking into a smooth, playful run toward the line of trees. Their paws sank into the soft earth, scattering leaves as they disappeared into the underbrush. Within seconds, they were gone, swallowed by the forest that had always been theirs. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected it to hurt, but watching them vanish was like saying goodbye to a piece of himself. the part that had woken up the day he found them. "They'll be all right," Emily said softly beside him. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the trees. "They belong here." Karen stepped forward, her arms crossed, the corners of her mouth curving into a small smile. "You gave them back what was taken," she said. "That's more than most people ever do." Ethan didn't speak. The forest answered for him, the rustle of leaves, the sound of the stream, the whisper of wind through branches. All of it alive again, all of it whole. As the others began packing up the gear, he lingered by the stream. The water was clear and cold, sliding over smooth stones. He crouched and touched the surface with his fingers. The current was steady, alive, like the quiet pulse of the forest itself. He thought of the storm, the chaos, the silence, the small, terrified cries inside the hollow oak. And now the sound of running water replaced all of it. It felt like an answer, like the world finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Emily joined him. "Do you ever think about why you found them?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "I've thought about nothing else." "And?" He looked at the stream, then at the forest beyond. "Maybe I wasn't supposed to find them," he said. "Maybe they were supposed to find me." Emily didn't reply. She didn't need to. The truth of his words lingered in the quiet air between them. When he finally turned to leave, the morning had shifted fully into day. Sunlight poured through the trees, scattering golden patterns across the wet earth. The air smelled of pine and promise. Ethan paused one last time at the edge of the clearing, his gaze tracing the path the cubs had taken into the wild. "You're home now," he whispered. Then he walked back to the truck. As they drove away, the forest closed behind them, alive and endless. And for the first time since the storm, Ethan felt no emptiness, no lingering ache, only peace. The forest had taken back what was lost, and in doing so, it had given something back to him, too. A quiet, steady faith that life, no matter how wounded, could always find its way home. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a faint crack of a branch echoed. Not in fear this time, but in freedom. And Ethan smiled, knowing that this story, born in tragedy, had ended in life. Some stories remind us that even in a cruel world, compassion can bring life back to what was once broken. Ethan's act of kindness gave two orphaned cubs a second chance, and healed his own heart in the process. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more powerful true stories.